Recording. Hey guys, welcome. Another awesome evening here with ATDCFL as we are going to get into a digital encounter. We have an awesome speaker today. She's here with me on camera and, amazing stuff that she does with us. And before we get started, though, I'm going to go ahead and cover a few things for you. We do have a good friend. There we go. Hey, Janet, welcome. Welcome in. And Janet just joined us, Janet Earls. And, as I was saying, we're going to just cover a few details for you to keep you informed, let you know what's going on. We're closing the year strongly as a chapter, and that's because you guys are helping us out. And obviously, awesome speakers like Leah here, and you guys as well, being the awesome members that you are. So few things to remind you of and know. Obviously, you can go to our website, which is one of the best looking websites, or at least I will probably challenge any chapter in that. It's the best looking website in the nation of chapters. And I want to remind you that December 2nd to the 6th, we do have Employee Learning Week. So if you haven't heard about Employee Learning Week, is a special week that ATD celebrates, ATD National and the chapters, obviously. We celebrate it as well. It's the week in which you get to share and increase awareness of ATD, increase awareness of learning in the workplace, at your place. You can do it any type of activities. And if you go to our website here on the homepage, we do have a link directly to the ATD marketing materials and the ATD information materials on that. So if you click on that, it will take you to this page where there's a PDF that you can read and share with folks at work. Also information about sending your story if you want to be featured over at ATD National on the site. So great opportunities if you live here in Orlando or if you're joining us from other places, because we do have members also across the nation. And obviously, I share this on LinkedIn, but I'm going to share it here because we got to be proud of that. And, you guys got to be proud of this as well. We are chapter of the month, ATDCFL, this chapter of the month. Ooh, yay. I didn't have the budget to get the sounds, so I'm doing my own soundtrack. So
we'll provide some extra sounds.
Thank you, Leah. So we are chapter of the month, and that means, we won the award due to the Off the Cuff video blog or the vlog series, which is our YouTube channel. So if you go to our internal page on the site, you'll be able to, get direct access to the link there. To the YouTube channel. And we do have a mission. So if you have friends, they can subscribe, yourself can subscribe. We're trying to get 1,000 subscribers at least by the end of this month, guys. Otherwise, what will happen is we'll bring that content just to you, just to members. So far, that content has been public. So we've done some great things for people, and we have some awesome speakers. I mean, if you use Bloom's Taxonomy to create your learning objectives, you want to watch the videos that we got in there with Lauren Anderson. If you do ADDIE model, if you call it the ADDIE model, or if you think you do the ADDIE model, you definitely want to watch an episode there with Robert Branch. So you're doing this for you and for us as professionals to keep improving. So that's what's going on with the chapter, guys. As always, when we do any type of event, we'll let you know what's happening and what we're doing. And I want to take a quick moment to thank all of you power members as well. Those folks that hold not only our membership, but the national membership. So if you're national, or what they call a joint member, that could mean different things in California. If you're a joint member, please, take a moment to take a bow, take a knee. We love you and we cherish you. And last but not least, if you wanted to get involved with us, we are looking for volunteers, right? So I'm a dad jokes will come every now and then. And volunteers is our term. So if you want to be involved with what we do, you get to learn here on this page exactly what is it that we do in the different levels and the different positions and teams. And we're holding calls every week. So you get to learn more about that. So with that said, and I don't really like saying that. It's like a cliche that a lot of people say to it. With that said, with that having been said, just caught myself. All right. My name is Alex Salas. I'm president for ATDCFL, your chapter. And hey, we got Jimmy turning on his cam. All right, hey man, how you doing? Good to see you. We have an amazing speaker today. She was one of the star performers in our WILD conference, our Weekend in Learning and Development, that happens in August. And we're bringing WILD back in 2020. It's going to be even better. And obviously, we really hope to have you, Leah. But this lady is Leah Yeatts. Leah Yeatts just did an off the cuff with us as well. She is all about human performance technology and the ways in which we can improve the workplace learning environments, not just with training, but also with a performance mindset. And well, without further ado, I'm going to introduce you, Leah Yeatts. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it, Alex, and it's nice to see all of you.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and share my PowerPoint with you, and then we'll get started.
Yes, good to do that. So one thing I will mention, guys, I'd love for you to have a cam on. Jimmy, I'm going to turn yours off just because we want to watch the bandwidth. Nothing personal, but man, I really appreciate you doing that. All righty, so Leah, go ahead and take it away. Let us know if you need anything. I'll be here on the chat, guys, monitoring if you have any questions. And I hope you enjoy this digital encounter.
All right, thank you very much. I should say before we start, since we are a smaller group, if you all want to chime in at any point in time, please feel free. You can post questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask questions or make comments throughout, feel free to interrupt. I'm open to that, and I'd much rather talk back and forth than talk at you during this time, so don't hesitate to do that. Tonight will be...
Yes. Before you get started, just wanted to, I think we got a little bit of a freeze. Okay, we got your back. We're good.
Oh,
just
okay.
The camera feed was a little bit. Okay, good. So we're ready to go. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully the connection will be okay throughout. So tonight we'll be talking about when training can't fix that, performance consulting strategies for learning and development practitioners. Before we get too far into things, just a little bit about me. I am owner and principal consultant at Lever Performance Consulting. I have a master's in organizational performance and workplace learning from Boise State University, and I'm a board member from your neighbor chapter over across I-4 at ATD Florida Suncoast out of Tampa. So very involved in our chapter as well, and I've enjoyed the times that I've been able to crash your party as well and be part of your chapter events too. And hopefully that we can continue to partner on some things. And let me stop my camera and restart and see if that makes it a little bit better for you. All right, how's that? Am I still freezing up, or am I okay?
No worries, if it freezes up, we'll just work it out.
Okay.
You know, things happen, we'll work around them.
Yeah, it sometimes my internet is a little sketch, but hopefully it's been consistent lately, so hopefully it'll be all right. All right, I wanted to start with kind of telling you about why this topic is so important to me. This topic of human performance technology, performance improvement is something that really early in my learning and development career I came to value. And just a little more background on me, I actually used to teach middle and high school history before I transitioned into the field of learning and development in the corporate world. And the first job that I had in learning and development, one of the assignments I got was to design and develop and facilitate a train the trainer for a particular organization. This organization had hired the company that I was working for to come in and do this train the trainer, and they said, these trainers are horrible and we need you to fix them. So we expected, and me and my naive self in my first job thought, I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna wave my magic training wand and we're going to make these trainers top notch, and it will solve all the problems of the organization. Now, probably those of you who are participating already are ahead of where I was at that point, and knowing that that's just not how it works. So it was very much a learning experience for me, but what we were tasked with by the director of that organization was to teach these trainers presentation skills. They were training new hires, and the new hires were reporting that they were not learning what they were supposed to be doing, what they were supposed to learn in their onboarding experience. So the assumption was made that these trainers weren't doing their job, and they weren't very good because the outcomes weren't there. And so they said, come in, custom design this whole training on presentation skills, teach them how to train. And they flew 4 of us across the country to do this 2-day long training with all of these trainers on presentation skills. Well, we did a pre and post assessment with these trainers, and they had to do a little mini presentation at the beginning, and we scored them on a rubric. And of course expected that they would have horrible presentation skills. That's the whole reason why we had been brought in. You probably see where this is going, right? So we get in and they do their little mini presentation as their pre-assessment, and they're actually pretty good at presentation skills. So I questioned in that early role, why am I here? And what is the point of this job that I'm in now? What am I doing here? These people know how to present, and I have to spend the next 2 days teaching them presentation skills, and this is a waste of time. So I did a little further digging and built a little more rapport with these people over the 2 days. And what I discovered over some lunchtime conversation was that they were not permitted to update any materials as policies and procedures changed in the organization. And so they were having to teach these new hires with materials that were not accurate. And so they would stand in front of the classroom and they would say, here's my PowerPoint, and this is not correct anymore, and that's actually not right either, and all of these things that they necessarily couldn't change. And so basically we found out there were really some process problems going on there, and they couldn't fix it because they weren't allowed to change any of the materials. And so that really sold me on the, it's a little bit more, there's more to this than just looking at these knowledge and skills of these trainers. There's really some process and procedures that need to be changed in order for this to be effective. So to start this conversation of how we start to look at that, we really have to understand this idea of a performance gap. And a performance gap is really pretty straightforward, and you may already know this, so forgive me if it's a little basic for some of you. I just want to make sure we've covered in case someone's not familiar with what that is. But basically a performance gap is the difference between the current performance, so what people are doing right now, and the desired performance of where we want them to be. And a performance gap may be people are underperforming and they're just not meeting our expectations, but it can also be people are new to an organization and so they just haven't learned yet. It can also be that the desired performance is changing, and so there's a new initiative, something in the organization is changing, there's a new strategic plan, and what people were doing is not going to work for the future. So that that target is moving, and that's what creates that performance gap. So there can be a lot of different reasons for that. The common assumption that I saw in that really early job, and then I've continued to see in my career since then, is that the performers are not doing the thing being whatever it is we want them to do, that desired performance. They're not doing it because they don't know how to do the thing, and therefore they need training. Does anybody else see this assumption being made? And feel free to chime in the chat. It's something that I'm seeing a lot, that people assume that just because there is a performance gap and because it exists, that training is the solution. And we jump to that. Okay, Scott says he sees that all the time too. And especially now that I'm an independent consultant and I see like lots of different organizations, and Jimmy agrees too, it's a really, really common thing. And it surprises me how often that happens, that this assumption is made. And so we have to ask the question, what if they aren't doing the thing because there's a problem with their resources, with the way that expectations are communicated to them, with the feedback they receive, the time that they're allotted, their motivation, the culture, the way that they're incentivized. I could go on and on and on with this list for a long time. I won't, but you get the idea that there are other factors at play rather than just they don't know how. So I'd love your thoughts with my example of the effects. So when we go in, and you can think of my example, or if you have your own, feel free to share that too. But when I went in, I did this train the trainer with these people on presentation skills. What do you think the effect was on the performance gap if it wasn't caused by the fact that they didn't know how to do that stuff? Yeah, little to none, zero. Yeah, absolutely. What about effects on the participants? Yeah, Scott says lower morale. And we definitely saw that. I didn't put all of these pieces together until later because at the time I was just starting to learn about performance improvement, but then in retrospect, being able to reflect on it, I really think that, and we did get some negative response from some of those participants. And at the time, I didn't quite understand the whole picture of it, but looking back, it's like half of them were offended that they were having to go through this training and that there was all of these processes that were problematic for them and a system that didn't support them, yet they were being told essentially the problem is you don't know what you're doing. So that's definitely, yeah, that's a hit to morale. Scott says leadership doesn't know L&D, and sometimes that's true. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, depends on the organization. What about effects on the organization as a whole in situations like this? So no effect on the performance gap, possibly lower morale for the participants. What about for the organization as a whole? Scott says continued frustration and confidence, low priority for L&D, no L&D leadership at the table. Yeah. Lack of confidence, Scott, in learning and development.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, that was it. It is, the L&D doesn't believe in leadership and vice versa.
Yeah, and especially when this type of stuff happens, it doesn't help that situation, right? Because leadership thinks that L&D is going to solve a problem, and then it's not solved. And sometimes L&D gets thrown under the bus in those types of situations. Then it comes back as L&D. And fortunately, I wasn't in the job that I was talking about for very much longer, so I don't know how all of that played out, but I can only imagine that probably, yeah, that there was a lack of confidence in learning and development, in our case, in the company that they had hired to do this, because it didn't solve the problem. I'm getting a message, my camera's not working great, so I'll just shut that off.
It's fine on my end.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll keep it off, and if it's distracting to you, you can hide it or close it. But I'll
Actually, you're right. Leave it on then. It must be an issue on my side. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. So in processing through all of this early on, and it just so happened that as I went through that experience, I, at the same time, was learning about performance improvement for the first time in my master's program. And it really sold me on, this is important and this is a problem that we really need to solve. And then ever since then, I've seen so much more, or so many more examples of those types of situations. And learning and development people, in a lot of cases, and not always, but in a lot of cases, who are unaware that that's what's going on. And so, I mean, even the people that I worked with at that time, I don't think really understood the depth of how off we were in trying to solve that problem. I don't think they took the time. And like I said, this was, just informal lunchtime conversation that I'm like uncovering these process issues. And I don't think, I think there probably were people on my team who left thinking, okay, we did great. We checked that box, solved that problem and everything is good. But the organization didn't have its problems solved. So what do we do about that? And this is kind of where we get to the heart of it. The most important thing is to look at the cause of the performance gap. We have to accurately diagnose the cause of the performance gap so that we can prescribe effective solutions. So if you think about a doctor really needs to know why you're having the symptoms that you're having, or they're not going to be as effective in treating whatever your issue is. If they're just treating symptoms and they're just, giving you a prescription and they don't really understand why there's a problem, it's not going to be as effective in actually solving it. And so it's really the same idea in performance improvement, is diagnosing that cause before you do anything else. So what is performance improvement? It's actually a field of study and practice. It was born out of the field of instructional systems design in the late 60s, when they were realizing that instructional systems don't solve every problem. So naturally, it's kind of like other field was born out of that just for that very purpose. I like this definition that Pershing gives of performance improvement. It's a systematic approach to improving individual and organizational performance. And that organizational piece is super important. And this, I think, differentiates it from a lot of L&D thinking too, is that there's this focus, and really an even greater focus, on the organization as a whole, as opposed to just the individual learners, and looking at the organization first and what they're trying to accomplish before you're really worried about the individuals and what they're doing or learning. Other names for the field: Human Performance Improvement, HPI; Human Performance Technology, HPT; Workforce Performance Improvement. All of these pretty much mean the same thing as performance improvement. So if you hear those elsewhere, just FYI. And then it's also one of the competencies in the ATD competency model, one of the areas of expertise that's listed there. So we'll look at some common performance improvement models so you can really have some practical tools to put this into practice, and to kind of figure out how to think about those things the next time you're in a position where you're given a training request. So we'll look at the International Society for Performance Improvement Human Performance Technology model. So that's a mouthful, but ISPI HPT model. Is anybody familiar with that model already, or is that brand new? Is that what
I am. It was in the CPLP material.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, good. Anyone else? So I'll assume it's new for the others of you. And if you are familiar with it already, feel free to chime in if you have things to add as well. And then ATD has a really similar model, the HPI model. These two are almost identical. So we're going to look at the ISPI model just because it's what I typically use, but honestly, it doesn't make a lot of difference which one you use. They're kind of the same. Okay, good. Shannon is familiar with it too. Fantastic. And then we'll also look at Chevalier's updated behavior engineering model. Anybody familiar with that one? Originally, the behavior engineering model was written by a guy named Thomas Gilbert back in the 70s. And then in, I believe it was 2002, Roger Chevalier updated and modified it, but it's a great tool. Okay, Scott's familiar with the behavior engineering model, and it looks like he may be the only one. Okay, cool. So maybe spend a little more time on the other one, since several of you are familiar with the first. This is the ISPI HPT model. So some of you have seen this before. And Alex, if you could throw that first link into the chat. This is pretty small text, and if you're having a hard time seeing it on your screen, Alex is going to put a URL in the chat so that you can go to the source of this model, and you can either look at it there while we're chatting if it's easier for you to see, or you can save it for later in case you want to reference it later. Then that's fine too. But basically, we'll look at just briefly overview this model. We're not going to go into a whole lot of details. There's that link. Thank you, Alex. But I do want to look more at kind of the application of it, and then how the behavior engineering model fits into it, because I think that's really where it becomes practical for us to use. So we'll look at each individual piece first, especially for those of you who haven't seen this before. So the first section is all about the performance analysis. And there's several pieces to this. First being the organizational analysis and environmental analysis. So it sounds complicated and fancy, and it's actually really simple. It's just making sure that you're familiar with the organization that you're working with. What are their goals? What are they trying to accomplish? What's their vision, mission, values? If you're internal, you probably already know that stuff. If you're external, you might want to take some actual time to be intentional in learning that. And then understanding the environment in which that business operates too. So this is not a super time-consuming, complex thing. It can be, but usually in practice, it doesn't have to be. And then next is looking at the performance gap. So the desired performance, the actual performance, and what's the difference in between the two. And really clearly defining that, and really clearly making sure that all of your stakeholders are on the same page with that too, and especially what that desired performance looks like, because sometimes there's disagreement about that too. And so just walking through this process, again, assumptions, and sometimes we can assume, well, we know what they're going for, and maybe not everyone on the stakeholder team is on the same page.
Hey, Leah, we got a question there from Scott. Aligned with OKR?
OKR, Scott, what is OKR?
Objectives and key results.
I'm not familiar with that, so you tell me. Does it align with this? I would love to know.
Well, as I went through the CPLP process, I was really, the HPI stuff was so eye-opening to me, because I'll just confess, in all the years that I had been in training, nobody had ever brought this up. We were always just order takers. Here's a training, go make it. We would jump right into ADDI, and I read that HPI thing like 3 times through and just thought, how in the world did I get this far and not even know what it was? Then as I started looking at some of the other materials, the OKRs, objectives and key results, are basically, if you read books like How Google Works and the tech sector, Silicon Valley is huge on this. It's basically getting everybody aligned. So in step 1, when you're talking about the organizational analysis, and I read constantly, so forgive me, I forget which book led to which book, but yeah, they all kind of run together after a while.
That's okay.
But this is sort of the learning and development version of an OKR. And I was going to ask, does anybody have any thoughts about, is that a good way to kind of pitch it to senior leaders? Because the MBA and the C-suite crowd are really big on OKRs now. At least I work for a tech company, at least in the tech side.
So in the tech industry. Yeah, that's one I'm going to have to look into further afterwards. Now you've got my attention about.
I'll put the name of the book in there, and it was really good.
Are you referring to How Google Works?
Well, that was one of them, and then I'll put the name of the other one in.
Okay, good. Fantastic. Thank you.
Hey, this is Shannon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, I have to say, last Friday, the 1st, we in Austin, I'm here in Austin. We had ATD Leader in Learning day-long conference, and so we had a panel discussion, and the VP of communications for our local cable company, Spectrum, but he brought that up too, and the question that was given to him was, how do you engage a global workforce? And he went on to explain OKRs. So that message, to back up what Scott said.
Great. And you think it does align with this model, Scott?
Very much so. And sorry, I'm muting. My daughter's going to be running around in the background, so I keep myself muted.
I understand.
And I'm looking it up. It's called Measure What Matters, and the author is John Doerr, Doerr.
Okay.
And now he comes heavily out of the tech world, Intel, Google, and those kind of places. But as I was listening, I do a lot of audiobooks. And as I was listening to it, I kept flashing back to HPI, because this is an area that I want to circle back to. And I work for a great company. They're super supportive of L&D. I've got great leadership. So a lot of the gripes other people have, I don't suffer with. And even with a company as good as mine, we still, on a scale of 1 to 10 on the HPI, I'm going to say we're probably a 4, maybe a 5. So,
I would say that's well above average, just based on my experiences.
Well, and again, that's because I have a really supportive leadership team. We've
Yeah,
got very open, they welcome our input and actually listen to us.
that's great.
And
Yeah.
then but as I started listening to the OKRs, and I thought, well, if this is really the buzz with them right now, at least in the tech world, then if you want to pitch HPI to your stakeholders, if you model it, you say, okay, in the MBA world, it's called an OKR. Here, it's kind of like HPI. They're not exactly analogous, but it's a close enough analog to work.
Yeah, and I don't think you necessarily even have to, and I often don't use the terminology even that I'm using tonight when I'm talking with people that are not working in L&D or when I'm talking with business leaders. And so you can talk to them about the process in the language that they understand or even in layman's terms. And I think there's still a lot of value in understanding that. So like, I wouldn't take this HPT model into a business leader and say, I'm going to go through this. Like, it's a lot of text and there's a lot of words in here that don't mean a lot to a lot of people. I mean, even the human performance technology label, I think, is like, what does that even mean, to a lot of people? But to understand the process and be able to implement and communicate the process, I think is something that's you can get buy-in for, because it is the way that businesses want to work. I mean, business leadership, they're looking at that, back to that organizational analysis part. You start talking about their goals and what they stand for, and you prove that what's going on in their strategic plan and how they're reaching that, and you're familiar with all of that, and then aligning what you're doing to that, I think is not something that business leaders are necessarily expecting from L&D people sometimes.
I don't think L&D people expect, in fact, and I reference back to the CPLP in the material, they talk about a trainer who she spends 6 months developing, I think it was a communications course or something, delivers it with smashing success. Everything is wine and roses, and ultimately she fails because she didn't align to the overall business mission. And I got to tell you, they had me hooked the entire way. I'm like, oh, she's a winner. She got it. L&D crushed it. At the end, I was like, oh, oops.
Exactly. I mean, it's a make or break, and that's why I care about this so much, and that's why I've spent so long studying it and I've built my business around it, is because it's a make or break for everything else that we do. And so we can be the best designer, best developer, the best facilitator, the best e-learning developer, all of that. If we miss this, then there's the potential that none of the rest of it matters. And so
I know it's hindsight being 2020, but do you think in the story you told about flying across the country to that company and doing the trainer, if you would spend a day covering this just this HPI slide you have up right now with a stakeholder and some L&D people, could this have kind of been the bridge where they both looked and went, that's the missing piece?
Yes. And I think, and I'll actually, when I show the other tool too, we'll kind of see how that can be used too. I wouldn't take this model exactly verbatim and put it in front of them, because I think it's a lot for people in L&D. But I would ask for permission to do some preliminary analysis, is what I would call it, because that doesn't sound too threatening or time consuming. And I would have talked to some of the participants, some of the trainers, to get enough information that was equivalent to what I got in that lunchtime conversation, which was that they're not allowed to update PowerPoints. There's all these process problems. And then I would have gone back to the director with that information to get buy-in to do like a more formal analysis. I would have said, look, here's some other things that I found, and they're going to be barriers to the training being effective. That's kind of how I phrase it a lot of the times, because if you have somebody and they brought you in specifically to do training, you don't want to be like, I'm not going to do training for you. And usually there is some sort of knowledge or skill thing that you can find that's a piece of it. But if you say, look, I want to make sure there's not other barriers that are going to prevent this training from having the effect that you want it to have, and then bringing some of that preliminary information to the table.
Awesome.
Then,
hey, we're doing a time check. We're at 7:35. Just
okay. Yeah, we'll keep moving then. So performance gap, looking at that. And then this is kind of the most important, or maybe not the most important, but a piece that gets left out, I think, a lot of times with learning and development practitioners, which is the cause analysis. And we talked about determining the cause of the performance gap, looking at the environmental factors, and that's just everything external to those performers, everything that's outside of them and their environment. And then the individual factors, which would be the stuff that's internal to those performers. More on that in a second. Then the intervention selection, that's just a fancy way of saying this is the solution to our problem. This is the way that we're going to close that performance gap. So if we found when we've done our cause analysis that the skills and knowledge, if you look under individual factors there, if there's a knowledge or skill gap, then our intervention selection is going to include training or some type of learning and development solution. And if we found other things, which is really likely if we've done a good analysis, that we're going to find things in multiple areas, then we're going to apply some solutions to that too. Then we implement whatever those solutions are. We evaluate at different levels. We won't go into a lot of detail on that tonight. And then it's all wrapped up in change management, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do, is affect change. We're trying to affect change in the performers, in the performance, and then ultimately in the organization. So that's another digital encounter for another day. So we won't go too much into the change management stuff tonight either. So if you are an instructional designer, there's some familiarity here, right? There's our good friend Addie kind of lying in there. But the difference being that it's not analysis specifically with the intention of building training, like it would be with Addie. It's analysis of the performance with an attitude of being neutral toward what the solution or solutions could be. So that first piece is the biggest difference between this and Addie. But otherwise, that similarity is there in the implementation and evaluating your solution. So I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip that scenario, but we will look at another one. But I want to make sure we get to this other tool. Before we do, in using this tool and in using the ISPI model, data collection is a really important part of this process. And there's a lot of different ways that that can be done. You can interview people, and that can be pretty informal focus groups. Surveys, you got to be cautious with surveys. You don't get a lot of depth of data in surveys, but surveys are good if you've done some interviews and you already think you have a good idea of what's going on, or you've determined, well, it's true of these people that I interviewed, and you want to be able to generalize it to a larger population. Surveys are good for that type of thing. I don't usually do surveys when I have no clue what's happening yet, because I don't even know what questions to ask, and I need deeper data than I can really get in a survey. Observations of the performance, if it's something that's observable, and then reviewing existing data. And that can be any type of performance data. That can be, I've looked at employee engagement survey data, customer survey data. That can be a lot of different things. Okay, so the other model that I want to show you is the updated behavior engineering model. And Alex, if you could put that other link in the chat, that would be fantastic. Perfect, thank you. And that's actually a whole article, and within that article, this is included. And there's an older version and the newer version is included in that article. You probably can see it on the screen because I'll zoom in just a second, but you might want to save that for later. But this is specifically for the performance analysis piece of things. This will help you determine the cause of the performance gap. And it's a great tool. I had a professor who used to call these the tools to think with. And I think that's a perfect way to put it. Like, the tool is not magical in and of itself, but it gives you a framework for the thinking. These are the things that I need to look at. These are the things that I need to investigate. So you'll notice there's two rows, the top row being the environment and the bottom row being the individual. And so these are all of the possible causes of a performance gap, could fall into these categories. The folks who research this have found that most of the time when there's a performance gap, there are environmental factors contributing to it. So it's really important, not only that we don't skip it, but usually starting with it, and that's why it's on the top, that's intentional, is a good place to start, because usually there are environmental factors at play. So this is the top row, and there's three different sections for the environment. There's the information that the performer has, so that could be the expectations of what they're supposed to do, the guides for them to do it with. And then second is the resources. Do they have the materials, tools, processes, procedures, and environment? That's a big one. And a lot of times I find stuff in this category. And the example I gave at the beginning, resources was a problem, right? And processes were a problem. The way that they're incentivized is another thing to look at. And that can be formal and informal incentives too. I like to think of it as what are the performers getting out of doing things the right way, and what do they get out of doing things the wrong way? And it may not be like, you know, incentive pay or some type of formal system. It may just be there's some type of positive or negative consequence to the way that they're doing things. And then the individual factors. So there's your knowledge and skills, which we would use training for any knowledge or skill deficit. Their capacity, are they able to do it? And then their motives as well, because as we all know, there are people who are able to do things and then don't want to for whatever reason. And so you have to look really at all 6 of those areas. I'll give you one other example of a time I used this behavior engineering model. This was a real example with a resort in Florida. And there were these front desk agents who were required to use a particular set of sales strategies when someone would call the front desk. So someone would call and they would answer the phone, and they were required to ask questions like who the travelers were, is it business travel or personal travel, what are you doing while you're here, you know, all these different things to get to know the people, with the purpose of being able to upsell whoever's calling on the things that the resort had to offer. So they were recording these calls, and they found that these front desk agents were not using these sales strategies consistently. And they had already been trained on this stuff. So at corporate headquarters, they decided these front desk agents needed to be trained again, because the assumption is made that if they're not doing it, they don't know how. Back to that assumption. And so fortunately, the manager at this property realized there was more to it than that. And there were people who were able to do some analysis that I was able to be a part of. And watching what was going on, observing them at the front desk, and also talking to them, which doesn't seem like rocket science, but it blows my mind how infrequently people actually talk to the performers about what's happening. So often it's just go build this training and then we're going to roll it out. But in talking to them and observing, it was really obvious that they're not using the sales strategies because there's a line of people standing at the front desk, and they need to tend to those people who were in front of them first. And so they were getting off the phone as quickly as possible, instead of going through all these questions and the upsell and all of this stuff. It was like, I'm going to answer your questions real fast, and I'm going to hang up the phone because I have people in front of me. And when the people were not in front of them and the desk was quiet, they were using all of those sales strategies. And so, and in looking at the knowledge and skills and asking, do they have those knowledge and skills? Well, we can see they do because they're able to do it in certain circumstances. And sometimes I like to ask, if we gave them $1 million, would they be able to do that thing right now? And that's usually a pretty good indicator of whether there's a knowledge and skill deficit or whether there is not. So what the resort ended up doing was they ended up contracting with a call center. If it rang more than 2 or 3 times at the front desk, it would go to this call center. They could use all of those sales strategies because they're in a call center and they're not in a rush. And if the desk is quiet, then the front desk agents could pick up within 2 rings or whatever the limit was and go through the whole conversation with everyone. So Scott says, sorry, I gotta drag my chat back over so I can see it. He's borrowing the $1 million question. Yeah, I use that with stakeholders a lot because I think it makes it easier for people to understand that that's what we can address with training solutions, you know, and we're not going to address, are they motivated to do it, or is the system working for them? But that kind of brings it home to people. So yeah, feel free to borrow that. So with the resort example, the front desk agents, they had the information, they had the resources, the incentives. Really the biggest thing for them, and again, this is not like the formal incentive system, but they had a positive consequence to not doing what they were supposed to be doing, right? So if they got off the phone, they did things, the quote unquote wrong way, they can make the people in front of them happy. And that's a positive consequence to the undesired performance. Whereas if they're doing the desired performance, they can have a negative consequence, because then the people in front of them are probably not going to be happy. They've got a line full of angry people. So the incentives are important to look at, not just formally, but in an informal way too. And then it's important, even when you do find something in the environment, to look at the individual different categories as well, because like I said, there can be things happening in multiple categories. So we did look at the knowledge and skills to make sure, yes, there's a systemic process problem going on here, but we also need to know that they know how to do it. And we confirmed that they could. They did have the capacity, and then they were motivated to do it. They wanted to do it. They were just weighing the options for what made the most sense. So any questions on that model specifically before I give you a few final thoughts, and then we can take some overarching questions too.
All right, folks, take the opportunity here. Come off the mic if you want to, and if you can, or let me know in the chat, or let us know in the chat your question.
I think the biggest question I have, first of all, fantastic information. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
And again, this just builds on what was in the CPLP materials. It's nice to see somebody who puts it into action every day. If you were going to go sell this to stakeholders, what is the single biggest roadblock you encounter?
I think the biggest is that stakeholders are in a hurry.
Mm-hmm.
And when they believe that they are at a certain point in the process and you're saying, hold up a little bit, sometimes that's a tough sell. And that's why I do it kind of in stages. So I don't say, stop with the intervention selection. We're going to go way back and we're going to do all of this analysis now, because that's just not a realistic sell most of the time. But to say, can I just take a day and talk to some of the performers and get a little more, and sometimes I can even frame it as this is part of my training analysis, and it is. But then when if that starts to turn up some other barriers, to go back to the stakeholder and say, you know what, my preliminary analysis is showing me there might be some process issues, or there might be some resource issues, or whatever the case may be, that could be barriers to this training being effective. So if I could take a little more time and do either some focus groups, or if I could talk to these other folks, or if I could do a survey, just to make sure that what we're doing with this training that you've requested is going to work and it's going to reach the goals that you want to reach. I feel like that's a much easier sell once you've already have like a little bit of that preliminary data to then go and collect some more. And it doesn't have to be, theoretically, you could spend months and months on performance analysis. I haven't encountered an organization yet where that's really feasible. So it really doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be a really lengthy thing. But I think when people start to understand, like, this whole training that you're investing in now, we want to make sure it works. And this is what we have to do just to make sure it's going to have that effect, as a good way to communicate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Let me give you a few more thoughts, and then I think we should have a couple minutes left for more questions if you have more questions at the end. I did want to give you some examples of non-training interventions, so other than things that would address those knowledge and skill deficits. This is just some examples, and there are many, many more, but process and procedure improvement, employee feedback systems, job aids and performance support can address a lot. Incentive systems, formal and informal. Organizational restructuring can address some of these performance causes. Mentoring and coaching programs, and I could have made a list that's hundreds of items, but I just wanted to give you some examples. But obviously what's important is that it's addressing the cause of the performance gap. Some final tips, stay focused on the business results and the performance that supports it. So that's what I love about using the HPT model is it starts with business results. It starts with that organizational analysis and knowing what that is, rather than starting with like writing our learning objectives or, you know, wherever we start, if starting with the business results and then looking at the performance that supports it and then looking at that cause, that order of things is really important. And then I call it the walk backwards. And that's when, as learning and development professionals, so many of us are thrown into, here's the training request. And that's kind of the middle of the HPT model, right? That's the intervention selection. Taking the time to walk the client or the stakeholder backwards into some of that analysis of the causes of the performance gap before really acting on the training, design, and development piece of it, or whatever intervention turns out to be appropriate. Be careful to remain solution neutral. So again, in that analysis, not going into it with the idea that this is just so that I can make training, but that training may or may not be an appropriate solution here, or it might be training and some other things that need to happen. I heard someone say once, and this stuck with me, that if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. I think as learning and development professionals, sometimes we walk around with our hammer because we know how to use it. We know how to train and we know how to use learning development solutions. And so we think everything is a nail. But if we go into it and say, I may or may not have the tool for this, I need to figure out, is that a nail or is that something else? And then we'll go from there. And that's being solution neutral. And then use hard data to justify your recommendations. I think it's much easier sell if you can go in and say, this is the results of the interviews I did, or the surveys I did, or the data that I examined, rather than going in saying, I think we need to do all of these things. And it's not exactly what you thought we were going to do. Then it sounds like an opinion and they may or may not agree with you. But if you have some hard data to back up whatever it is you're recommending, that makes a huge difference too. If you're interested in digging deeper on some of this, these are just a couple of recommendations. The first one is fantastic. First Things Fast, a handbook for performance analysis by Allison Rosette. I love it because it tells you how to do stuff quickly. And in the world that we all operate in, that's important. And it's a very, very practical and readable guide that I use often. A Guide to Assessing Needs is another good one. It has just a whole bunch of different tools you can use for analysis. And then if you want to learn more, ATD has a couple of different options as well. I have not been through these, but I've heard they're good and they're exactly about this topic. They're Improving Human Performance Certificate, and then the Basics of Human Performance, which is a self-paced e-learning module. And both of those are available from ATD National. All right, any final questions?
Awesome stuff, awesome stuff. Thank you, Leah. That's a great presentation as always. Okay, guys, hey, take the opportunity to ask questions. I did drop the link there for the survey, for our post-event survey. It's only about a couple of questions, so don't be afraid. Don't get scared on that one. It's only a couple of questions to get your feedback, so we know that the speakers we're bringing are the speakers you want to see. Make sure that you comment. Make sure that either you unmute yourself and ask a question. We'll give you a few minutes here to interact with us. No, wait a few seconds. Here we go, Scott and Shannon. All right. Hey, Shannon.
Hi. Hey, great presentation, Leah. I really appreciate it. I don't know that I have any burning questions now, but the one I think where you addressed, where you go in and you're kind of stuck right there in the middle at intervention already. And so how you backwards, how you kind of walk backwards and trying to take the client into, some questions that will take them back into those initial critical tasks. So that was the burning one I had. See, how often do you, is that a barrier? I mean, to me, it would seem like, when you're working with an organization and they're needing to make some changes, they jump right to that. They say, we need training. We want to do 5 days of training with this new software rollout. And we want some content for our LMS as well. That's what we want. And, you know, that's that they've already defined the interventions. To me, that would seem really frustrating. Do you often get that when you are working with clients, or have you ever pulled back from someone because they were so lockstep into wanting to provide training as a solution?
I haven't had to pull back. There has been times where they're not as interested in having that analysis done as I would like them to be. And as long as I feel like the training is addressing the gap, if they choose not to address the barriers, I can't always control that. If I am, and I haven't encountered this yet, but if I am ever in a situation where I feel like it's like back to that first job I had where it's like, this is completely wrong, I would at that point probably separate myself from that client, because I want to bring value to the organization. And so in order to do that, I need to make sure that it is going to be valuable. I do find that it's easier as an independent consultant than it was when I was internal. Because in the very first conversation with them about whether we're going to work together, I'm framing the way that I operate for them. And so they know before we ever sign a contract, this is how Leah works. Basically, this is what you're getting with Leah. Mm-hmm. So I think the way that I communicate that now is easier. It's much more difficult when you're internal, I think, because sometimes you don't have as much control over the situation, I guess. But I think when you do start to bring those questions to the table, people do start to see over time this pattern of, if I bring a training request to Leah, she's going to want to know X, Y, and Z. So, there's this expectation that this is the way that you think. And so it's hard to get people into that mindset. But I think if you keep kind of pushing it and you have to educate the people around you too, because you can't expect that, people who haven't encountered this before, don't know anything about this, are going to just buy into it automatically. But I think once, you kind of hold their hand and educate them through it. And I should mention too, with that behavior engineering model, it's a great tool to communicate your findings to stakeholders too. I actually use those boxes and put my own information in them to say, here's the different things that we looked at. And I think once people start to see it, then they start to see the value of what it is.
I was looking at that, and have you thought of breaking that down, that behavior engineering model, into like a matrix?
All right, go ahead.
So you can see different levels.
I was going to say, guys, this is the last question. Go ahead, Leah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, that's okay. Yeah, I don't break it down further. I usually use those broader categories, but they look different each time depending on what I find. So I do kind of customize it each time, but the framework itself I pretty much use as it is.
Awesome stuff. Hey, so guys, thank you so much for attending. Leah, again, a great job. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise and knowledge. We're going to have this video that has been recorded and the presentation materials uploaded to the internal page by tomorrow. So if you weren't here, you can check it out. And if you were here, you can check it out again. Leah, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
You're very welcome. Thank you all for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.